So which units in the Space Marine army are closest to auto-include territory for the faction right now? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines once more, and in this video I thought we'd talk through a few of the easiest things to add into a Space Marine army, run by absolutely tons of competitive lists, and what makes them good. In 40k 10th edition, the detachment system maybe works better for some armies than others. I'd argue in Space Marines it's actually done okay at creating internal balance. Out of the detachments they have access to, 4 of them are genuinely quite strong, and are each fairly viable ways to play Space Marines, focusing around different big damage combos depending on exactly what sort of flavour of force you're running. In general, Space Marines definitely need a power boost right now, but it's kind of interesting that per the detachment it generally means that your mainline damage dealers don't actually tend to be auto-includes in every Space Marine army, as the detachments push you to really quite different ways of play, say Ironstorm with some big tanks as your heavy hitters, Firestorm often revolving around transports and close range shooting. As a result, it often more tends to be smaller skirmish units for board control, doing secondary objectives, actions and holding points. They often tend to be the more auto-include units, maybe particularly in Pariah Nexus with its focus on actions and secondaries being kind of harder to do. For this video I thought we'd talk through 3 units that are near auto-include status for pretty much most of the Space Marine detachments out there. Then for a 4th one I thought I'd focus on one for the 4 most commonly played competitive detachments for core Codex Space Marines, so Vanguard, Firestorm, Gladius and Ironstorm, and then round up for a few more honourable mentions of some other units that are just very easy to include in Space Marine armies right now, where I don't think that they'd ever really be a particularly bad choice regardless of detachment. Jumping straight into it, we have the Neophyte Space Marines in training, the Scout Squad. 65 points for 5 models, and they've been a staple and competitive list basically since the Codex dropped. The main advantage of the Space Marine Scouts is they're just super cheap and expendable versus the vast majority of other Astartes units out there. All the other infantry squads start at least 70 points per 5 models, even including the tactical squad split down into 2 halves. In 40k it's often just nice to have super cheap units to be able to screen and to make good trading units, so say when the opponent jumps forward, destroys your unit, and then you can attack them in turn. If all you lose out of that exchange are 5 Space Marine Scouts, then it might well have been a good trade overall. For the 65 points, the durability is fine for that cost, 5 models with 10 wounds and a 4+ save, and while their damage output isn't particularly exciting, it's still not awful for how cheap they are. They do get a heavy weapon, a fun sniper rifle and a chainsword plus some small arms, so they should be able to at least threaten a bit of damage on most targets, even if that isn't their focus. What just takes them from being good to great though is their mid-board control, and the big advantage it gives you for objectives. It's pretty powerful that they can both infiltrate and scout, so ideally you could start them in the mid-board and then also have further repositioning to give them a bit of movement after you know who's going first, potentially even going right up into the opponent's face and doing damage first turn if it made sense, or maybe trying to play a bit more cagey and better hide behind ruins if they get first turn. They've also got the ability to return to reserve for late game secondaries, maybe popping up on the flanks turn 4 or turn 5, maybe even threatening charges on a home objective if the opponent hasn't been able to screen them. I'd say their war gear maybe isn't the biggest thing to focus on. They have a lot of options, but they're mainly just valuable for being a somewhat okay squad for damage and defense that can get to where they need to be and be expendable. I'd probably be most tempted by the missile launcher, sniper rifle and chainsword plus some variation of small arms. I have seen some people just ditch the sniper or use a heavy bolter. Plenty of things are kind of fine really. For how to use them against most opponents, I'd ideally want to deploy them hidden and ideally within range of an objective marker in the midboard. That would mean that the opponent would have to come to them and deal with the squad if they want to take that point, or push up with something that's got enough objective control that you might be able to attack in turn. And being somewhere towards the midline of the board should give you better options for achieving a bunch of first turn secondaries, a lot of which needs to be further up the board, or maybe doing actions on midfield points and things. Against different opponents as well, we could also think about their scout screening and move blocking type things. Maybe if the opponent's got some scary monster or vehicle threats that you might be able to block the movement lanes of, or say if they've got some horrendous scout move melee potential like World Eaters, having a cheap unit of scouts just sitting in front of their lines and stopping them getting any closer to the bulk of their force might be a really big win. I feel like for their most value, if they're just left to camp on an objective and not threatened for a bunch of the game, that could rack up a lot of victory points for a cheap investment. And maybe later in the game, depending on how things are folding out, you could think about their return to reserves type thing. That could be a really good option later on when there's fewer units on the board. It might be better to have things in reserve to threaten their home board objective, or just being popping up in the right place to do certain secondaries. In general, it just seems hard to go wrong with maybe 1 or 2 units of 5 of these. They're common in all sorts of lists. Next up, for fairly godly objective skirmishing units, we've got the Jump Intercessors, 80 points per 5 models, and just kind of like the Scouts, really quite cheap and just good all-round value. Where the Scouts bring some very cheap infiltrate and redeploy things, these guys bring fast movement, deep strike, and a better damage output. If you start them on the board, then they move 12 inches with fly, which can reach quite a lot of places, and should be able to bound up to the mid-board quite easily. If they're in Deep Strike Reserve, then they can be a unit to Deep Strike to do actions and objectives, or if there don't happen to be any cards that you've drawn for that, they could just try and threaten a long charge, or even use Rapid Ingress to drop somewhere safe and then get the jump on some enemy objective grabbers. When they hit home, they've got a good amount of punch for their 80 points. They're pretty effective against anything that's a similar sort of Space Marine kind of weight class, or any lighter infantry. A couple of plasma pistols, a power fist, and their mortal wounds can mean that they can deal a bit more damage to heavier stuff than you might expect as well. When they make a charge, each one has a 4+ chance to deal a mortal wound if they can finish within engagement range. You could also think about using the grenade stratagem as well if it made sense. If they can do that and a bunch of mortal wound impact hits, it does mean in theory you could be looking at around about 5 or 6 mortal wounds, and that could be surprisingly punchy against something tough that they'd otherwise not be able to kill very well. Finally, for their speed, deployment options, and melee threat, their durability is kind of good as well. 16-point Space Marine profiles are kind of run-of-the-mill, not standout tough, but not standout bad, and given their other advantages, I think it's pretty fine. As mentioned, for war gear loadouts, I'd be tempted by the Power Fist on the Sergeant just to make them a bit more general purpose against some medium infantry. A couple of plasma pistols that you could think about overheating or not depending on the target. Usually just 5-man squads, no need to build out for 10 of them. And in terms of detachment support, the Blood Angels specifically do very, very well with them. 5 attacks each with Strength 6 chainswords is a lot more brutal, plus a Strength 10 Power Fist on the charge as well. And they could justify building out to a squad of 10 of them much more than other things with their damage support stratagems. In general, they could be used kind of flexibly depending on the mission and matchup. I'd be a little bit more inclined to deep strike them if the opponent doesn't have masses and masses of board control screening type things, but they feel like they could be a good skirmish unit, either deep striking or bounding up from one bit of terrain to another, to both be in a place to skirmish for objectives or pounce on lighter armoured enemy things moving forward. For units that go in reserve, I'll be primarily on the lookout for actions to drop down and do. Things like behind enemy lines, deploying teleport homers, or even being in board quarters for engage on all fronts. Though otherwise, if that doesn't happen, they could risk some 9-inch long charges, which would always be a gamble. But if it's going to be absolutely game-changing, a coin flip chance with a command point reroll budgeted certainly isn't nothing. Otherwise, they could either just drop down in cover and prepare to charge next turn, or think about using Rapid Ingress to get them on the board and then get them a near guaranteed charge against an outlying enemy unit. Between them and the Scouts, they're just a unit that it's hard to go wrong with. A couple of units to bound around doing objectives and still put out some good melee threats when they need to, particularly against lighter stuff. I've seen a lot of armies often tend to run in the region of 2 squads of them. Finally, for maybe the most staple also include in a whole bunch of Space Marine lists, we have the Infiltrators. These again are infiltrating sneaky Phobos Marines, 100 points per 5 guys. Some lists do take multiple units of them, though I'd maybe be a little bit more tempted just to take the one singular unit of them, and then be able to use them flexibly depending on whether the opponent's got deep strike threats or not. They can be infiltrated and put themselves in the mid-board where they have some alright durability. 2 wounds with a 6+ feel no pain is fine, but you do pay more per the unit of them than a bunch of other Space Marines out there. They can use smoke as well. I'd say actually putting them in the mid-board is probably their secondary purpose though. If the opponent's got scary deep strikers that might be threatening your home field, it's often just best to have them camped on your home board objective and deny deep strike at 12 inches, which does work on 3-inch deep strikes as well. I rate their damage output as really quite poor and inflexible. They basically just contribute a whole bunch of AP0 attacks at range and melee. Basically, it's only really going to be any good against light infantry, things like toughness 3 with bad saves, which they will be able to chip away at, but in general I'd certainly prioritise keeping them safe over trying to get a few more stray bolt shots. You don't want them just destroyed at long range and stopping doing the objective things that you took them for. For support options, they generally don't need all that much. They've got the Helix Gauntlet and the Comms Array to farm some command points. Maybe the biggest decision for them is whether or not to take a Phobos Librarian along, which some armies like to. That effectively gives them lone operative style shooting protection, so they can't be shot at greater than 12 inches away, and that makes them into an incredibly safe unit, where they'll stop reserves coming in, and also they can't be shot at longer range, so pretty much guaranteed board control there. The Librarian can chip in a little bit to their damage output as well, rebuffing deep strikers that drop outside of the 12-inch range. That adds a lot of expense to the unit though, and most people just tend to run small units of 5 of them unsupported. As mentioned for how to use them, I generally prioritise putting them on the home field objective if it's one of the missions that scores you points for that, and otherwise just look at what units your opponent might be deep striking or teleporting around the board with. If they've got the potential to 3-inch drop with something seriously nasty, then their screening ability might be the best to protect some key units from your force. And if that's not really a big factor and most things are just starting on the board, you could just use them as a sort of scout style infiltrate unit fighting over the mid-board objectives, where they're at least fairly tough and have that smoke stratagem. I feel like in general though that the units that you take for deep strike sort of matchups, fairly godly against some opponents, maybe not quite as good as scouts in terms of points to good board control, but I feel like enough armies out there really hate that 12-inch deep strike denial to make them well worth it. Otherwise, to take a look at the 4 detachments most commonly played in competitive for Codex Space Marines, I thought we'd talk through one lightly auto-include from each here. For Gladius Task Force, it kind of has to be a fire discipline character, either a lieutenant or an apothecary biologist. They're generally good damage increase characters anyway, giving lethal hits to their unit, allowing things like aggressors or hellblasters to punch up against their foes. But Gladius with fire discipline for an extra 30 points takes them to an entirely crazy level. Fire discipline gives you sustained hits 1, and when you're in Devastator Doctrine, that goes off on a 5+ for critical hits, so it basically means that every single shot out of your unit will get both a sustained hit and a lethal hit on a 5+, which is a combination of buffs that makes just about any weapon in the game into a seriously scary one. Perhaps for the turn that they first deliver their damage, you can use Devastator Doctrine just as per the core detachment rules out there, though you can still buy it in for 1 command point after if you need it again, and then have them target the Oath of Moment target for the turn and use the hit reroll to reroll anything that isn't a 5+. Typically they often tend to be used with Boltstorm aggressors, maybe jumping out of a Land Raider, perhaps Hellblasters coming out of a Repulsor, or being teleported in with Uriel Ventris or something, or perhaps a unit of Eradicators used similarly. Those all have their pros and cons, but it basically propels any of them to absolutely fantastic damage dealing. The Eradicators maybe being the least general purpose out of them, though just double down on absolutely wailing on big stuff like tanks and monsters. If desired, you can also add a 1 command point Storm of Fire for an extra pip of AP and ignores cover. I think it really would depend on the exact unit that you're using with how you go about using them, but the most important thing is guaranteeing the first strike rather than getting hit first. So that likely means a big chunky transport like Repulsor or Land Raider, or teleporting in with Uriel Ventris. Some units could work kind of fine foot slogging with Advance and Shoot and Devastator though too. Basically the game would be to dump the big damage combo into the biggest scariest enemy threat around to soak up as much as possible and not just overkill something small. So it might be a game of cat and mouse as to delivering them to that before they get attacked and destroyed. For Ironstorm Spearhead, perhaps unsurprisingly, it's the Tech Marine as an auto-include here. I feel like he's probably the one to mention more so than any single one vehicle datasheet, as there's quite a lot of viable stuff, and Ironstorm Spearheads might look very different, maybe going heavy on the Redemptors, Vindicators, Repulsor Executioners, Gladiator Lancers, and there's a bunch of other tanks that are very viable beyond that. Tech Marines just have great value whenever there's vehicles about though, just at base for the 55 points. They give you +1 to hit for 1 vehicle and heal D3 wounds. Doing that for a couple of turns on meaningful targets will likely justify his points cost. You can use his pseudo lone operative special rule to kind of stand out in the open on objectives if needed, and for a cheap support character he's got more damage than you might expect, chipping in with that Forge Bolter plus quite a lot of damage to attacks that he gets more of if a vehicle gets destroyed nearby. For Ironstorm Spearhead, obviously is better than most. There's going to be lots of vehicles around, but he can also bear the good enhancements. The cancel a damage result one is maybe one of the most powerful and guarantees to add value. If you use that against a big, say, D6+1 las cannon shot, then that could be something like 50 points worth of vehicle saved then and there. Never mind doing it on multiple turns. A Master of Machine War is still very good as well, and you can still use the lethal hits one. Ideally, he likely wants to be in support range of multiple different vehicles, just in case some of them get shot up. Probably the best ones to go for are the ones that don't have a native boost to the hit roll when they're on the move. So Vindicators, Redemptors, maybe Repulsor Executioners if they're moving around the board. All of those feel like they're the right balance of a big unit that it's meaningful to buff. Hit on a 3 natively, maybe the Repulsor Executioner might be able to stay still, but often it won't be able to. And also tough enough that there's a good chance that they ride out a turn of enemy shooting and then live to have some repairs done to them. Just being a cheap unit with a sort of pseudo lone operative is handy enough in itself. can be good for doing a little bit of extra screening, and can be a good cheap unit to do actions with as well, which he'll still be able to do whilst going about his business of buffing the unit. For the Firestorm Assault Force, I feel like there's maybe 3 different units that I most want to talk about for this. I decided to plump for talking about the Eradicators, which are fairly terrifying close range anti-tank damage for the Marines out there at the best of times, but get far scarier here. It's 95 points for 3 of them. They already are on paper the single best anti-tank and monster damage output per point for Space Marines, against say a toughness 10 vehicle targets. A squad of these guys even outside of melter range will do only slightly less damage than a Gladiator Lancer, and they cost less than 100 points where the Gladiator Lancer costs 160. Never mind what happens when they get within melter range and all their guns get a +2 damage to their result. The numbers are pretty crazy there for their points cost. Basically the compounding effect of 4 rerolls to hit, 4 rerolls to wound, and 4 rerolls to damage is absolutely potent when going after tough monster and vehicle targets. On top of that though, Firestorm just makes them thoroughly next level. Strength 10 melter weapons at 12 inches, which is absolutely huge versus toughness 10 tanks. It means they're wounding 3/4 of the time as opposed to just over half the time with their rerolls, so massively more dangerous there. The assault keyword helps them get in range a whole load, as range is one of their limiting factors. Out of a transport it greatly increases their threat range. And then they've got a nice stratagem in Crucible of Battle for a +1 to wound if they need it as well. Potentially meaning that you could be wounding things like knights on a 4+ re-rolling, which is all nice and reliable compared with how you'd expect for melter, or even wounding toughness 10 vehicles on a 3+ re-rolling, which is going to make a very nasty mess of them very quickly. For war gear and support options and fielding them, it certainly makes sense to take the 3 multi-melter per 3 models. Both units of 3 of them and of 6 of them can easily do good work here. I probably wouldn't bother with support characters for them personally, though some people like them. And I guess one thing to mention if you are running Salamanders is that Vulcan Hestarn can be of genuinely good use to them, giving them some rerolls even if they don't happen to have monster vehicles within their line of sight. Can be nice if you're playing against an army of Terminator equivalents. As usual with these guys, the main difficulty is getting them into threat range. I think ideally something like a Repulsor or even a Land Raider Redeemer could be a good choice to deliver them in Firestorm. They can be really good support for various transport stratagems there, and Repulsors can defend them against charges. I have heard of some people using 3 of them and put them in a Land Raider Redeemer alongside a different unit threat, so you've got 2 different options that could threaten to jump out and do good damage of their own sorts. Otherwise, against the right foe, being a counter-attack unit starting on the board is a bit more viable when you can advance and shoot, or you could use Strategic Reserve if the opponent can't screen well. Basically, however they're played, they need to coordinate attacking tanks and vehicles, getting their melter shots off before they get destroyed in return, elite infantry as a second option, and basically overcoming their weaknesses, being shorter ranged, fairly mono task, and the weakness of getting tagged in melee. In general though, I feel like they're hard to go wrong with in Firestorm. Probably for other rivals here, I'd be most likely to talk about Flamestorm Aggressors, which are pretty savage, along with a Gravis Captain, or maybe the Land Raider Redeemer itself. A pretty terrifying transport with its own good close range fire damage, that again I think is rarely going to be a bad choice in Firestorm. Finally, for the most commonly run Space Marine competitive detachments, we've got Vanguard Spearhead, and since shortly after the Codex came out, it's very much been the Ultramarines ruling the roost here. The vast majority of armies that have done well in competitive play have tended to have the combo of Marneus Calgar and Uriel Ventris both on the board. Uriel Ventris is a cheapish Space Marine captain, generally run with Assault Intercessors or Company Heroes, just for his melee profile as a cheap sort of mid-board bully unit, where his own damage profile is kind of seen like the extra. In this detachment though, is really here for granting a different unit Deep Strike, which you can grant to things like Devastator Centurions, though maybe Eradicators or Hellblasters could also do if you wanted, which just makes them incredibly powerful at bouncing around the board when there's a 1 command point return to reserve stratagem on the offering, essentially meaning that you can have a bunch of Devastator Centurions Deep Strike onto the board, blast an enemy unit into tiny little pieces with las cannons and missile shots, and unless the enemy manages to step up with some seriously heavy guns to punch through that 2+ save armour, then at the end of their turn they can warp off the board for 1 command point and then come down to draw the bead with the las cannons on the next most important thing to take down. With the Centurions in particular, it's a very nasty combo, as they basically have very good damage output, but their main weakness is they're not particularly fast, and perhaps not crazily tough as well against the right sort of firepower, whereas Uriel and Return to Reserve, plus the Vanguard Spearhead innate rules, both work really well for them. Otherwise for Vanguard, the absolute staple is Marneus Calgar, paired with a character that allows him to infiltrate, often the Apothecary Biologist with Blade Driven Deep and a bunch of aggressors. and that just gives you a ridiculously powerful mid-board threat of a unit, a bit of a Death Star style squad that will destroy most thing that it touches. 10 models worth of big threat, most of them armed with a whole bunch of twin-linked high-threat power weapons, plus having the Victrix Honor Guards that can tank some big hits for the aggressors, bouncing things off their 2+ saves or their invulnerable saves. Calgar lets the whole unit advance, shoot and charge, so a big threat range there. They've got some nice Vanguard stratagems, such as getting extra AP on their shooting if they hit something over 12-inch range. Calgar rustles up a command point each turn, and certainly gives your opponent some big decisions to make as to whether or not they put units in charge range of the enormous squad, which they're likely going to have to do if they want to take the mid-board. It's definitely a big play unit that if you let them get killed too easily, it's going to have a very bad effect. It's not a long way off 500 points in one terrifying unit, and isn't realistically all that tough for that cost, but it's tough enough that any one unit is going to really struggle and probably fall short of killing it, even if they get a big turn of damage in. Finally, just for our last few honourable mentions, here are a bunch of other things that I think are kind of hard to go wrong with in any Space Marine army list, but just maybe not quite as ubiquitous as the main three that I mentioned before the detachment specific stuff. First up, we've got the Gladiator Lancer, nice and simple, great big gun with enormous rerolls that destroys tanks at long range. I'd probably rate it as the single strongest of the Space Marine armoured damage dealers right now. It's not really super flexible against other targets besides a few small arms, and not enormously tough for the points, but it does its main role well. Inceptors kind of feel like the luxury pick version of Jump Intercessors in a way. They pay 50 points more per unit of them for a unit that can 3-inch drop with some scary firepower. For their damage and defense, they aren't really very good in terms of pure points efficiency, but they just pay a lot of points for that 3-inch drop rule, which is kind of godly. They can put that damage either exactly where they need it, or basically 100% guarantee that you can do certain secondary objectives, which when it comes to winning overall missions can be the important thing. At 130 points though, they seem to be much more seen as a take or leave style option, as opposed to the absolute must include in literally every army list that they used to be. Otherwise, the Combi Weapon Lieutenant often finds himself supporting all manner of Space Marine lists. He's cheap, annoyingly tough, and a hard-to-catch lone operative unit. His reactive move means that the enemy might be able to move close to him, then he just goes away to the other side of a ruin, and basically means that they're unlikely to be able to deal with him in any one turn. Can just be nice for disruptive screening, maybe nuisance charges when you feel ready to sacrifice him, and pretty great for doing actions. He isn't going to deal any really significant damage of his own, but he does give you a handy debuff on one mid-board objective as well, which might add up to a little bit of extra firepower over the course of the game. Finally, I thought it was worth mentioning the Land Raider Redeemer. Despite the points increase, it's still one of the most popular ways to get big damage combos into the mid-board. A massive chunky tank that, with Armour of Contempt and cover, a lot of armies are just going to fail to shoot down. When it gets into the mid-board, it's a spectacular Overwatch threat with those Flamestorm cannons, and it's got a big transport capacity that can, say, deliver 6 aggressors plus a character for things like Gladius, or maybe various interesting things in Firestorm. It's definitely a lot more balanced with the other Land Raiders, now it's so much more, but it's still probably rated as the strongest of the three. In any case though, let me know what you make of some of the strongest and auto-include units for Space Marines out there at the moment. Look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments, and let me know which of these you use or don't use and why. If you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to see more like this, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel and you'd like to help support and keep them coming, Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.